Chijioke, a billionaire known for his sharp business sense and powerful influence, had everything: wealth, status, and a seemingly perfect life. However, beneath the surface, he was plagued by one pressing question. Could he really trust the loyalty of his young wife, Amaka? His past experiences in both business and relationships had taught him that money often clouded true intentions, and Chijioke couldn't shake the feeling that Amaka's love might be tied to his wealth. Late one night, Chijioke decided to take a drastic step to uncover the truth. Before executing his plan, Chijioke sought counsel from his longtime driver, Emmanuel, and his personal doctor, Dr. Kalu. Chijioke paced around his luxurious office for several minutes. He had called Emmanuel and Dr. Kalu for a meeting. He needed them to be part of his plan, something he never imagined he'd be doing, yet here he was. The door to his office opened, and Emmanuel stepped inside, followed closely by Dr. Kalu. Emmanuel was a man in his late 20s, loyal and steadfast, having driven for Chijioke for over a decade. Dr. Kalu, on the other hand, was a more recent acquaintance, a brilliant physician but someone Chijioke trusted implicitly with his health. "Good evening, sir," Emmanuel greeted, taking off his cap and bowing slightly. He was always respectful, never stepping out of line. "Evening, Chijioke," Dr. Kalu said with a nod. He seemed slightly puzzled by the unusual late-night call. Chijioke motioned for them to sit, his fingers drumming lightly on the glass surface of his desk. "Thank you both for coming. I know it's late, but I have something important to discuss. What I'm about to say must stay between us. No one else can know, especially not Amaka." The two men exchanged glances, sensing the seriousness of the situation. Chijioke cleared his throat, his voice steady but tense. "I need your help with something unconventional." He paused, weighing his words. "I'm going to stage an accident. I want Amaka to believe I'm paralyzed." Emmanuel's eyes widened slightly, while Dr. Kalu frowned, leaning forward in his chair. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish with this accident, Chijioke?" the doctor asked. Chijioke hesitated for a moment. "I need to know if Amaka truly loves me, or if she's only with me for the money. I can't shake this feeling, and the only way to find out is to see how she reacts when things go wrong. If she stays by my side through this, I'll know her feelings are genuine." Emmanuel rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, this is a big risk. What if something goes wrong? And how long do you plan to keep this up?" "I've thought about all of that, Emmanuel," Chijioke replied. "We'll make it look real but safe. That's where you and Dr. Kalu come in. I need you, Emmanuel, to stage the accident. You'll be driving when it happens. And, Dr. Kalu, I'll need you to corroborate the story, to tell Amaka I'm paralyzed." Dr. Kalu's frown deepened. "This isn't a small thing you're asking, Chijioke. Faking a medical condition, especially something as serious as paralysis, can have lasting consequences. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Chijioke nodded, resolute. "I've never been more certain about anything in my life. I need to know the truth." Emmanuel sighed, realizing there was no talking him out of this. "All right, sir. How do we do this?" The plan was set in motion. The following evening, Chijioke sat in the back seat of his sleek black SUV as Emmanuel drove through the quiet streets of Lagos. They were headed towards a secluded road that was rarely used at night, the perfect place to stage the accident. Chijioke's heart pounded in his chest as they neared the predetermined location. His phone buzzed. It was Amaka, asking when he'd be home. "I'll be back late," he texted back, feeling a pang of guilt. He loved her, he really did. But this was the only way to be sure. Emmanuel glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "We're almost there, sir. You sure about this?" "Yes, Emmanuel. Do it exactly as we discussed." Emmanuel nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. As they approached a sharp bend, Emmanuel suddenly jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending the car crashing into a ditch by the side of the road. The impact was controlled but forceful enough to make it look convincing. Chijioke, having braced himself, was flung slightly forward, his body slamming into the seatbelt. He groaned, playing his part. "Call Dr. Kalu," he instructed. Within minutes, the blare of sirens filled the air as Dr. Kalu arrived with an ambulance. The paramedics hurried to the scene, treating the situation as a real emergency. They lifted Chijioke onto a stretcher, his body limp and unresponsive. Emmanuel stood by, his face a mask of worry and tension, playing his role perfectly. Dr. Kalu stepped forward, directing the paramedics. "Careful with his spine," he ordered. "We suspect a spinal cord injury." Chijioke kept his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. He had to sell this lie to make it convincing. Every move and every reaction had to be flawless. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Dr. Kalu climbed in beside him, giving Emmanuel a final, grim nod. Inside the ambulance, Dr. Kalu leaned down, whispering urgently, "This is the moment, Chijioke. From here on, you're paralyzed. Remember that." Chijioke blinked slowly, signaling his understanding. He would have to live this lie day in and day out, endure the consequences of his own test. He had no choice now. Now, several hours later, after Dr. Kalu and Chijioke had arrived at the hospital, Amaka, who had heard of what happened from a phone call by Emmanuel, rushed into the hospital, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Emmanuel stood in the hallway, his arm in a sling, looking downcast. He glanced up as she approached, and their eyes met. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice high-pitched with panic. "There was an accident," Emmanuel said quietly. "The doctors, they're not sure if he'll walk again." Amaka gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. She pushed past Emmanuel and into the room where Chijioke lay motionless on the hospital bed. His eyes closed, tubes and wires attached to his body. Dr. Kalu stood at his side, chart in hand. "Doctor, please," Amaka pleaded, her voice trembling. "Tell me he's going to be okay." Dr. Kalu looked at her, his face carefully controlled. "It's too soon to tell," he said somberly. "There is significant damage to his spinal cord. We've done all we can for now. It's up to him and time." Amaka staggered back, her legs threatening to give way. She gripped the side of the bed, staring down at her husband. "Chijioke," she whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "Chijioke, can you hear me?" Chijioke opened his eyes slowly, looking up at her with a pained expression. He had to remember his role, helpless, vulnerable. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a raspy whisper. "Amaka!" She leaned in closer, clutching his hand. "I'm here. I'm right here, my love. I can't feel my legs," Chijioke said, his voice breaking on the words, adding an extra layer of authenticity to his performance. "I can't move." Amaka's face crumpled, and she stifled a sob. "Oh God, Chijioke." Dr. Kalu intervened gently, touching Amaka's shoulder. "He needs rest now," he said firmly. "The next 24 hours are crucial. We need to monitor his condition." Amaka nodded, dazed, as she released Chijioke's hand. She turned to Emmanuel, her eyes searching his. "What exactly happened?" Emmanuel looked away, his face shadowed with guilt. "The road was slippery. We lost control. I'm sorry, madam. There was nothing I could do." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before turning back to Chijioke, her face a mask of worry and fear. "I'll stay with him," she said quietly. "I won't leave his side." Later that night, Dr. Kalu stood outside Chijioke's room, his hands in his pockets. Emmanuel joined him, glancing through the window at Amaka, who was seated by Chijioke's bedside, holding his hand. "She's in shock," Emmanuel whispered. "But what now?" Dr. Kalu sighed, his eyes fixed on the scene inside. "Now," he said softly, "we wait, we watch, and we see what lies beneath the surface." Emmanuel nodded slowly, his stomach churning with unease. They had set the stage for Chijioke's test, and the real drama was about to begin. Whether it would reveal the truth he sought or destroy everything Chijioke held dear was a question neither of them could answer. Not yet. As the night deepened, the hospital fell into a heavy silence, the kind that only prefaces the storm that is yet to come. And just in a twinkle of an eye, The next day came so fast. That very morning, the hospital room was bathed in a cold, sterile light. Amaka sat motionless by Chijioke's bed, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. She hadn't slept. Every time her eyes closed, the memory of the accident replayed in her mind. Chijioke lay still, eyes closed, as if lost to the world. The machines beeped steadily beside him, a mechanical reminder of his fragility. Dr. Kalu entered the room quietly, a clipboard in hand. Amaka looked up, hope mingling with fear in her eyes. "Doctor," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "is there any change?" Dr. Kalu shook his head gently. "The paralysis is still there," he said in a measured tone. "We've run some tests and there is extensive damage to his spine. I'm afraid his chances of walking again are very slim." Amaka's face crumpled, her hand flying to her mouth as a sob escaped her. She turned to Chijioke, clutching his hand. "Oh, Chijioke," she murmured, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What are we going to do?" Chijioke opened his eyes slowly, feigning the struggle to speak. His voice was weak, strained. "Amaka, I'm sorry. I can't be the man I was." She shook her head fiercely, squeezing his hand. "No, don't say that. We'll get through this. I'll take care of you. I don't care what it takes." A small, fleeting look of surprise crossed Chijioke's face. He hadn't expected such an immediate declaration of loyalty. But was it real, or was she simply reacting to the shock? His heart wavered between hope and doubt. He had to see how long her resolve would last. Dr. Kalu cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Mrs. Amaka," he began gently, "I need to speak with you privately if you don't mind." She hesitated, glancing at Chijioke, who gave a slight nod. Reluctantly, she followed Dr. Kalu into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind them, and Dr. Kalu turned to face her, his expression grave. "Amaka," he started, choosing his words carefully. "Chijioke's condition is going to require a lot of care. This is going to be a difficult journey, physically, emotionally, and financially." She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "What are you saying, doctor? That I should give up on him?" "No," Dr. Kalu replied quickly. "Not at all. But you need to understand what this means. His business, his life, it's all going to change. He'll need constant support. Are you prepared for that?" Amaka drew a shaky breath. "I love him," she said, her voice quivering but determined. "I married him for better or worse. This is just a test of that vow, right?" Dr. Kalu paused for a moment in shock. He wondered if she had somehow figured out this was all a setup. But no, after taking a few seconds to scan her face for any sign of doubt. He realized that there was none, at least not yet. So he nodded slowly, and responded, "Yes, a test," he echoed. "A very challenging one." After their discussion, Amaka returned to Chijioke's side in his room to reassure him, forcing a smile. "Doctor says you need rest," she said softly. "I'll be here, though. I'll be here every step of the way." Chijioke watched her, his mind churning. Was she putting on a brave face, or did she truly mean it? It was too early to tell. He had expected some initial sympathy, of course. Any wife would show concern after an accident. But he knew that the true test would come in the weeks and months ahead. He closed his eyes, feigning exhaustion, as Amaka settled into the chair beside him. Slowly but surely the days flew by one, each one marked by a repetitive cycle of medical care and silent, awkward exchanges. Amaka busied herself with the tasks of caring for Chijioke, bathing him, feeding him, and attending to his every need. She kept up a cheerful demeanor, but there were cracks starting to show, moments when her smile faltered when frustration flashed in her eyes. Emmanuel noticed it first. He observed quietly from the background, his role now reduced to an errand boy, fetching supplies and delivering meals. One afternoon, as he brought in Chijioke's lunch, he caught a fleeting glimpse of Amaka's expression as she struggled to lift Chijioke into a sitting position. Her face was tense, her jaw clenched in irritation. Emmanuel cleared his throat softly, and she quickly masked her irritation with a strained smile. "Thank you, Emmanuel," she said, her voice clipped. "You can leave it on the table." Emmanuel did as he was told, glancing at Chijioke, who remained silent, his eyes watching Amaka's every move. After Emmanuel left the room, Amaka let out a long sigh, slumping into the chair beside the bed. "This is hard," she muttered almost to herself. "I never imagined it would be this difficult." Chijioke remained quiet, his heart thudding in his chest. It was the first crack in her armor, the first sign that the burden was weighing on her. He wanted to reach out to comfort her, but he held back. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He needed to see where this would lead. Later that evening, Amaka sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. Chijioke watched her, sensing the growing tension in the room. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I don't know how we're going to manage," she said without turning around. "Your business, our life, everything is falling apart. We'll find a way," Chijioke replied, his voice steady. "Together," he said in a reassuring tone. She turned to look at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Together?" she echoed bitterly. "You're paralyzed, Chijioke. You can't help with anything." The words cut through him like a knife, sharper than any physical pain. But he kept his expression neutral. "I can still think," he said softly. "We can still plan. We're not defeated, Amaka." She let out a harsh laugh, turning away again. "It's easy for you to say. You're not the one doing everything." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Chijioke closed his eyes, fighting the wave of guilt and anger that rose within him. Was he pushing her too far? Or was this the truth he had been seeking? Amaka stood up abruptly, walking toward the door. "I need some air," she muttered, leaving the room without another word. As the door closed behind her, Chijioke let out a shaky breath. His heart ached, torn between his need for the truth and the realization that he might be driving a wedge between them that could never be repaired. In the empty room, he lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had gone too far. The test was only beginning, but the cost was already higher than he had anticipated. Luckily, the following week, Chijioke was discharged from the hospital and brought home in an ambulance. As he was wheeled into the mansion, the grandeur of his surroundings somehow filled him with hope and fear. On one hand, he was finally home. On the other, he still had to keep faking his life to test his wife. No one even him knew how long this test was going to last, and that was the most frustrating aspect of it all. As he was wheeled into his home that very day, his domestic staff stood quietly, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and uncertainty. Amaka walked beside the stretcher, her face a mask of determination, but her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. "Welcome home, sir," Emmanuel said, his voice somber as he pushed the wheelchair into the living room. Chijioke glanced around, taking in the familiar opulence that now felt strangely alien. He was no longer the master of this domain. He was a prisoner in his own home. Amaka forced a smile, trying to lighten the heavy atmosphere. "I'll take care of everything," she said softly, glancing at the nurses and staff who had been brought in to assist. "You'll see, we'll make this work." Chijioke nodded, watching her closely, wondering how long this resolve would last. The real test was beginning now, here, in the confines of their home. Every day would be a battle, not just for him, but for their marriage. The weeks stretched into months, and life became a blur of routines and unspoken tension. Amaka continued to care for Chijioke, but the cracks in her resolve widened. The strain of her new reality was evident. Her initial fierce determination had dulled, replaced by a weary resignation. She moved through the days like a ghost, performing her duties with a mechanical detachment. Chijioke watched her closely, his emotions a tumultuous storm. He had thought he was prepared for this, to see her struggle and watch for signs of her loyalty breaking. But the reality was far more painful than he had imagined. Every sigh, every moment of hesitation, cut into him like 1,000 knives. Yet, he remained steadfast in his deception, waiting for the undeniable truth to surface. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amaka sat at the edge of Chijioke's bed, Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She stared at her hands, her eyes hollow. Chijioke glanced at her, a pang of guilt shooting through him. He wanted to reach out and erase the pain in her eyes, but he knew he couldn't break the facade now. "Amaka," he said gently, "you've been doing so much. Maybe you should take some time for yourself. Go out, see friends. You don't have to be here all the time." She turned to look at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You want me to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," he replied quickly. "I just don't want you to feel trapped. You deserve a break, some time away from all of this." Amaka's gaze softened for a moment, and then she looked away. "I wouldn't even know where to go," she muttered. "My life revolves around this room now." Chijioke felt a lump form in his throat. This was exactly what he had feared. That in seeking the truth, he had reduced their relationship to this, a prison of suspicion and hidden motives. He closed his eyes, fighting the urge to confess everything then and there. But he reminded himself of the purpose. If her loyalty was genuine, it would endure. If not, the sound of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. Emmanuel entered the room, glancing between them awkwardly. "Madam," he said hesitantly, "you have a visitor." Amaka frowned, standing up. "A visitor? Who?" "Ifani," Emmanuel replied, a shadow passing over his face. "He said he's here to check on you and Oga." Chijioke's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Ifani. He was an old acquaintance, charming and wealthy, with a reputation for being a smooth talker. Chijioke had always felt uneasy around him, suspecting his intentions were less than honorable. Now, with Ifani entering their lives again, the test was about to take a dangerous turn. Amaka hesitated, looking back at Chijioke. "Should I tell him to leave?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "No," Chijioke said slowly, keeping his tone neutral. "Let him in. It's fine." She nodded, clearly confused, and left the room. Chijioke listened as her footsteps receded down the hall, his mind racing. This was a twist he hadn't anticipated. Ifani's presence could either reaffirm Amaka's loyalty or reveal the cracks he feared. Amaka walked into the living room, her face carefully composed. Ifani stood near the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the evening light. He turned as she entered, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Amaka," he said, his voice smooth, "it's good to see you. I heard about Chijioke and came as soon as I could." She nodded stiffly. "It's been difficult," she admitted, "but we're managing." Ifani's eyes softened as he took a step toward her. "I can't even imagine how hard this must be for you," he said sympathetically. "If there's anything I can do to help, anything at all, just say the word." Amaka forced a smile, feeling a mix of relief and discomfort. "Thank you," she replied, "but we're fine for now." He studied her quietly, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary. "You don't have to be so strong all the time, you know," he said gently. "It's okay to admit when you're struggling." Her eyes flickered with an emotion she quickly suppressed. "I know," she said softly, "but I have to be strong for Chijioke." In the days that followed, Ifani's visits became more frequent. He would drop by under the guise of checking on Chijioke and offering support. But Chijioke could see the way Ifani's eyes lingered on Amaka, the subtle compliments he showered on her. It was infuriating to watch, yet Chijioke remained silent, trapped in his own web of deceit. He had set this trap himself, and now he was forced to see how it played out. One afternoon, Ifani arrived with a bottle of wine and insisted they have a small gathering to lift everyone's spirits. Chijioke watched as Amaka hesitated before nodding, a shadow of reluctance crossing her face. They gathered in the living room, Chijioke in his wheelchair, Amaka and Ifani seated opposite him. Ifani poured the wine, handing a glass to Amaka. "To resilience," he toasted, raising his glass. "To face life's challenges with grace." Amaka forced a smile, clinking her glass with his. Chijioke watched her carefully. He could see the strain in her eyes, the cracks in her composure. The test was becoming unbearable for both of them. Yet he remained silent, waiting for the dam to break, almost like he was praying for her to break character and prove him right. But then after a few glasses, Ifani began to reminisce about the past, telling stories that made Amaka laugh, a sound that had become rare in their home. Chijioke felt a pang of jealousy and something else. Fear. Was she finding solace in Ifani's presence? Was he the escape she needed from the life that Chijioke had forced upon her? Ifani turned to Chijioke, his expression overly concerned. "How are you holding up, Chijioke?" he asked, his tone deceptively sincere. "This must be incredibly hard for you." Chijioke forced a thin smile. "It is," he replied coolly. "But we're managing." Ifani nodded, his gaze flicking to Amaka. "You're lucky to have a strong woman like Amaka by your side," he said, his voice dripping with admiration. Amaka looked down, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her glass. "I'm just doing what any wife would do," she murmured. Chijioke's heart twisted. There it was, the ambiguity, the uncertainty that haunted him. He needed more, a clearer sign, something undeniable. The real test came on a rainy afternoon. Amaka was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when Ifani arrived unexpectedly. Chijioke, from his position in the living room, watched as Amaka hesitated at the door, her expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. "I didn't know you were coming," she said, not quite meeting Ifani's eyes. "I just wanted to check in," he replied smoothly, stepping closer. "You seemed upset the last time we spoke." Amaka glanced at Chijioke, who was watching them with a blank expression. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tight. "You shouldn't be here without calling." Ifani's eyes narrowed slightly, but he quickly recovered, offering a charming smile. "I was worried about you, Amaka. I know this is hard, and I just want to help." She crossed her arms, looking conflicted. "Ifani, you need to leave." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't have to do this alone," he said urgently. "There's no shame in admitting you need more than this, more than him." Chijioke's heart pounded in his chest. All he could fathom was Ifani's audacity to come into his home and try to seduce his wife in his weakest state. But then again, this was it, the moment of truth. Would Amaka falter? Would she give in to the temptation standing before her? Amaka's face hardened. She raised her hand and pointed to the door. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and resolve. "I love my husband. I won't listen to another word." Ifani's face contorted with surprise, then fury. Without another word, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Amaka stood there, breathing heavily, her body shaking. Chijioke felt a wave of relief wash over him. She had chosen him despite everything. Yet the guilt surged up almost immediately. He had put her through hell, forced her into a situation where she had to prove her love in the cruelest way possible. Amaka turned to him, her eyes blazing. "You knew, didn't you?" she said, her voice raw. "You knew what he was trying to do, and you let him keep coming back. You never complained, you never said a word, which is unlike you even in your current state. Why?" Chijioke was silent, the truth hovering on his lips. He stared at her, seeing the woman who had stood by him, despite his doubts and insecurities. How could he explain this test, this trap he had laid for her? "I needed to know," he finally said, his voice breaking. "I needed to know if you truly loved me, or you just loved my money, my status, and my power." Amaka's eyes widened, her mouth dropping open in disbelief. She took a step back, her hand instinctively going to her chest as if to steady her racing heart. "You needed to know?" she repeated, her voice quivering. "You put me through all of this? To test me?" Chijioke's throat tightened. He had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, the words stuck in his mouth like dry sand. "Amaka, please," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't about hurting you. It was about the truth." "The truth?" Amaka let out a bitter laugh, one that cut through the air like a knife. "The truth, Chijioke, is that you doubted me. From the very beginning, you doubted my love for you. And instead of talking to me, instead of trusting me, you chose to trap me in this this sick game. Chijioke tried to reach out, his hand trembling. I was afraid, he admitted, his voice cracking with the weight of his confession. I was afraid that you only loved me for my money, for the life I could give you. Amaka stared at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. So you decided to fake a paralysis? She asked, her voice rising in anger. To make me prove myself? How could you do that, Chijioke? How could you be so cruel? He swallowed hard, his eyes pleading. I didn't see any other way. I needed to see how you would act when everything was taken away. She shook her head, the tears finally spilling over. You didn't take everything away, she said, her voice breaking. You just made me live in a lie. Every single day. I cared for you, worried about you, suffered with you. And all this time, it was just a test to you. Chijioke's eyes blurred with tears of his own. I was wrong, he whispered, the realization crashing over him like a wave. I see that now. I see how much I've hurt you, how much I've hurt us. Amaka turned away from him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. You don't get it, do you? She choked out. It's not just the lie. It's that you didn't trust me. You never trusted me. And now, I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Her words struck him like a physical blow, the full impact of his actions settling into his bones. The truth was laid bare between them, stark and unforgiving. He had tested her, doubted her, and in doing so, he had destroyed the very foundation of their relationship. Amaka, he said, his voice desperate, I know I've broken something between us, but I want to make it right. Please, give me a chance to make it right. She didn't turn around. For a long, agonizing moment, she stood there, her back to him, the only sound in the room the ragged gasps of her crying. Then, slowly, she lifted her head and turned to face him. How do you make right what you've broken? She asked, her voice hollow. You made me live a nightmare, Chijioke. You made me question my own sanity, my own love. How do we come back from that? Chijioke opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no answers, no magic solution to fix the mess he had created. All he had was his guilt and the faint hope that somehow she could find it in her heart to forgive him. Amaka wiped her eyes, her expression hardening. I need time, she said quietly, her voice like the calm after a storm. I need time to think, to figure out if I can even look at you the same way again. She turned and walked towards the door, her movements stiff and controlled. Chijioke watched her go, his heart in his throat. Amaka, he called out, his voice a pained whisper, but she didn't stop. She didn't look back. As the door closed behind her, the room was plunged into a heavy silence. Chijioke sat there, staring at the space she had just occupied, feeling the weight of his actions settle over him like a suffocating shroud. He had set out to test her, but in the process he had tested himself and found his own flaws laid bare. Later that night, Chijioke remained awake long after the house had fallen into darkness. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each moment stabbing at him like a blade. He thought about the look in Amaka's eyes when she realized the truth, the raw pain and betrayal. He had broken something precious, something that might never be mended. The door creaked open softly, and Chijioke turned his head, expecting to see Amaka. Instead, Emmanuel stepped in, his expression grim. He approached the bed, his eyes full of concern. Emmanuel, Chijioke croaked, his voice raw from hours of silence. Emmanuel looked at him with a mix of pity and disappointment. Oga, this has gone too far, he said quietly. I warned you. I told you this was a dangerous game. Chijioke swallowed hard. I know, he admitted. I see that now, but what do I do? How do I fix this? Emmanuel sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. Some things can't be fixed with words, Oga. You've hurt her deeply. This isn't about being right or wrong anymore. It's about trust, and you've shattered it. Chijioke's eyes filled with tears. I don't want to lose her, Emmanuel, he whispered. I thought this was the only way to know if she truly loved me. Emmanuel shook his head slowly. Love is built on trust. Without trust, love is just a word. You've got to give her time and space to heal and decide for herself. Chijioke closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. I don't deserve her forgiveness. Maybe not, Emmanuel replied softly. But that's not for you to decide. She has to come to that on her own. Back in Amaka's room, Amaka sat on the bed, staring at the wall. Her heart felt like it had been torn in two. She had loved Chijioke deeply, had devoted herself to him, only to find out it was all part of a twisted game, a test of her loyalty. The thought made her stomach churn with a mixture of anger and grief. She hugged her knees to her chest, her mind racing. Ifani's words echoed in her ears. You don't have to do this alone. And for a brief moment, she had felt a flicker of temptation, a flicker that scared her. She had been loyal, had chosen Chijioke time and again, and still he had doubted her. Could she ever forgive him? Could she ever look at him and not see the man who had manipulated her, who had forced her to prove her love under false pretenses? She didn't know, and that uncertainty weighed on her like a crushing burden. Amaka paced her bedroom, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and anger. Chijioke's betrayal felt like a stab to the heart. He had orchestrated this entire situation just to test her loyalty. The man she loved had become a stranger to her. She glanced at her phone on the nightstand. She couldn't stay here any longer. She needed space, distance from this house, from him. Without thinking further, she grabbed her bag, shoved some clothes inside, and snatched up her phone and keys. She couldn't bear to look at him, not now, maybe not ever. As she slipped out of the room, her heart pounded against her ribcage. Every step felt like a step towards an uncertain future. Emmanuel was nowhere in sight, and she took that as a blessing. She moved quickly, quietly, through the hallway, her breath hitching when she reached the front door. Taking one last glance at the house where her life had changed irrevocably, she opened the door and stepped out into the night. Amaka drove through the dark, empty streets, the car's engine the only sound in the silence of the night. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind replaying everything that had happened. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal. They mingled into a storm of emotions. How could he? She whispered to herself, tears blurring her vision. She had to get away, to think clearly without the oppressive weight of Chijioke's presence bearing down on her. She knew exactly where she was going. Her parents' house, a sanctuary where she could find comfort and clarity. They had always been her safe haven, and now, more than ever, she needed that sense of safety. But as she took a turn onto the highway leading out of the city, headlights flashed in her rearview mirror. Amaka glanced back, her heartbeat quickening. A black SUV was tailing her closely. She frowned, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. Why were they following her? She sped up slightly, hoping the car would pass, but it stayed behind her, matching her speed. Panic surged through her chest. Something was wrong, very wrong. Before she could react, the SUV swerved and rammed into the side of her car, causing it to veer off the road. Amaka screamed, struggling to keep control, but the car skidded into the ditch, coming to a jarring stop. She barely had time to breathe before the SUV pulled up alongside her. Two masked men jumped out, wrenching her door open. No, let go of me, Amaka screamed, kicking and struggling, but they were too strong. One of them clamped a hand over her mouth, while the other bound her wrists tightly with rope. They dragged her out of the car and towards their vehicle, her screams muffled against the man's gloved hand. Shut her up, one of the men growled. The other man pulled out a rag and forced it over her mouth and nose. A sickly sweet smell filled her senses, and within seconds, darkness engulfed her and she had been captured by the strange men. As all this was happening, Chijioke, back at home, was still in his room, the silence crushing him after Amaka had left the house in anger, and that was when his phone rang. He picked it up without checking the caller ID, his mind still occupied with thoughts of Amaka. Hello, Mr. Chijioke. A cold, unfamiliar voice hissed on the other end. Your wife is with us. Chijioke froze, his blood turning to ice. What? Who is this? What do you mean she's with you? The voice on the other end chuckled. a sound that sent chills down his spine. "You heard me. We have Amaka. If you ever want to see her alive again, you'll pay us 100 million naira." Chijioke's heart pounded in his chest. This is a joke, right?" he stammered. "Who are you?" "No joke, Mr. Chijioke," the voice said, all amusement gone now, replaced by a dangerous edge. "We know you're a wealthy man. You can afford it. 100 million naira, or you can kiss your precious wife goodbye." Chijioke's hand tightened around the phone, his mind racing. "How do I know you actually have her?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Let me speak to her. I want proof she's alive." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by the muffled sound of a struggle. A second later, Amaka's voice came through, strained and frightened. "Chijioke," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Please help me." "Amaka," Chijioke shouted, his heart in his throat. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "Enough?" The cold voice cut back in, snatching the phone away. "You've heard her. Now, if you want her back in one piece, you'll follow my instructions. No police, no tricks. 100 million naira in cash. We'll tell you where to deliver it." Chijioke's mind spun in a whirlwind of terror and regret. This was his fault. If he hadn't pushed her away, if he hadn't orchestrated this whole deceitful plan, she wouldn't have been out there, vulnerable and alone. "I'll get the money," he said quickly, his voice frantic. Just don't hurt her." "Smart man," the voice replied, a sinister undertone in his words. "You have 24 hours. And remember, if you involve the police, she dies. We'll be in touch." The line went dead, leaving Chijioke standing in the middle of the room, his mind a chaotic mess. The phone slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. He felt like the ground had opened up beneath him, swallowing him whole. Emmanuel burst into the room, his eyes wide with alarm. "Oga, what happened?" he asked, noticing the pallor on Chijioke's face. "They have her," Chijioke rasped, his voice barely audible. "They've taken Amaka." Emmanuel's face went white. "Who?" "Kidnappers," Chijioke replied, his eyes hollow with shock. "They want 100 million naira. They'll kill her if I don't pay." Emmanuel stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. "My God. Oga, what are we going to do?" Chijioke shook his head, his mind struggling to form coherent thoughts. "I have to get the money," he said, his voice trembling with resolve. "I'll pay them whatever they want. I won't lose her, Emmanuel. Not like this." Emmanuel nodded, his face set in grim determination. "Then we get the money," he said. "We'll do whatever it takes." Chijioke turned to look at him, his eyes burning with a mixture of fear and determination. He had already made a grave mistake that had put Amaka in this situation. Now he had to fix it, no matter the cost. He had to get her back. And this time there would be no test, no deception. Just a desperate man willing to do anything to save the woman he had nearly lost forever. As they began to make the necessary calls, preparing to gather the ransom, one thought echoed in Chijioke's mind. He had pushed her away, and now he was being punished for his betrayal. This was his chance for redemption, a chance he would take, even if it meant giving up everything he had built. But then Chijioke thought to himself, if he is going to save his wife, he can't just go about it haphazardly. Reflected on his phone call with the kidnappers. Their threats seared into his memory. He needed professional help, someone who could navigate the murky waters of ransom demands and, if possible, turn the situation to his advantage. There was only one person who came to mind, Emmanuel, his longtime lawyer. Emmanuel was known for his brilliance in the courtroom and his uncanny ability to think like the very criminals he often prosecuted. Chijioke grabbed his phone and dialed Emmanuel's private number. It rang twice before a familiar, smooth voice answered. "Chijioke, it's late. This must be important," Emmanuel said, his voice calm and collected, even at this hour. "Amaka's been kidnapped," Chijioke blurted out, his voice breaking. "They're demanding 100 million naira for her return." There was a pause on the other end, then a low, steady response. "Where are you now?" "At home," Chijioke replied, his breath shallow. "I need your help." I don't know what to do. I'm on my way, Izenwa said firmly. Stay put. 30 minutes later, Izenwa arrived at the mansion, his face a mask of concern and determination. Chijioke ushered him into the study, closing the door behind them. Emmanuel hovered nearby, but Izenwa waved him away with a curt nod. This was a conversation meant for the two of them. Tell me everything, Izenwa commanded as he settled into a chair. Chijioke recounted the events in a shaky voice. The phone call, the threats, Amaka's pleading voice on the line. As he spoke, Izenwa's face remained impassive, his eyes darkening with each detail. We have to pay them, Chijioke said finally, his voice trembling. We have to get her back safely. Izenwa leaned back, his fingers steepled. That's one option, he said slowly. But paying them doesn't guarantee her safety. It never does. Chijioke's eyes widened, a cold fear gripping him. What do you mean? If we give them the money, they'll release her. Maybe, Izenwa said, his tone icy. Or maybe they take the money and kill her anyway, to eliminate the risk of being identified later. Chijioke felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him. No, he whispered, shaking his head. No, that can't happen. Can't lose her. Not now. Izenwa leaned forward, his gaze piercing. We need to think this through carefully. You're a man of means, Chijioke. We can pay them, but that might not be enough. We need leverage and advantage. Chijioke's hands balled into fists on his lap. What kind of leverage? Izenwa's eyes gleamed with a dangerous glint. We need to make them fear us more than they fear losing the money. You have connections and resources. This isn't about simply handing over the cash. This is about sending a message. Chijioke was silent, Izenwa's words swirling in his mind like a storm. The fear and panic that had gripped him since the phone call began to transform into something else. Anger. Burning, seething anger. These men had taken Amaka, his wife, the woman he now realized he had wronged so deeply. She had proven her loyalty, and now she was suffering again, not just because of his doubts, but because of these criminals. How do we make them pay? Chijioke asked, his voice low, almost a growl. A slow, predatory smile spread across Izenwa's face. You need someone who can deal with this kind of filth. Someone who isn't bound by the law or morality. Someone who can retrieve your wife and make sure these men understand they made a grave mistake crossing you. Chijioke's heart pounded. Who are you talking about? Izenwa pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He stopped at a name and looked up at Chijioke. A hired professional. An assassin, if you will. He's discreet, efficient, and most importantly, ruthless. He doesn't just rescue. He eliminates threats. Chijioke hesitated for a moment, the weight of what he was about to do pressing heavily on his conscience. Then he thought of Amaka, bound and terrified, held captive by faceless men who had taken her. His hesitation vanished. Call him, Chijioke said coldly. I want my wife back, and I want those bastards to pay. Izenwa nodded, dialing the number. He put the phone on speaker, the line ringing twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Who is this? The voice demanded. Izenwa, the lawyer replied calmly. I have a job for you. There was a pause. Then the voice spoke again. Go on. A client's wife has been kidnapped. He needs her retrieved, unharmed, and he wants the men responsible dealt with permanently. Another pause, longer this time. What's the payout? 50 million, Izenwa said without missing a beat. 25 upfront, 25 upon completion. Location? The voice asked. Izenwa glanced at Chijioke, who nodded. They haven't disclosed it yet, Izenwa replied, but they will soon. When they do, we'll be ready. The voice on the other end let out a low chuckle. Fine, I'll handle it. Send the details when you have them, and the initial payment. Consider it done, Izenwa said, his tone devoid of emotion. The line went dead, and Izenwa pocketed his phone. He turned to Chijioke, his expression unreadable. It's in motion. When they contact you again with instructions, you'll comply. But we'll have our man in place. He'll follow the exchange, and once your wife is safe, he'll do what needs to be done." Chijioke nodded, his mind whirling with the gravity of what he had just agreed to. He was entering a world far darker than any business deal he had ever made. But for Amaka, he would cross that line. For her safety, for her life, he would become the monster these kidnappers feared. Meanwhile, as all this was happening far away from Chijioke's mansion, somewhere the kidnappers used as their hideout, Amaka woke up in shock, her head pounding. The room was dark, damp, and cold. She was tied to a chair, her wrists chafing against the rough rope. Her mind raced, struggling to piece together the fragments of what had happened. The car, the men, and then nothing. She heard voices outside the room, low and muffled. She strained her ears, trying to make out what they were saying. "They're going to pay, right? He's not going to call the police?" One voice muttered anxiously. "He won't," another voice responded, this one more confident. "Chijioke is too smart for that. He knows what will happen if he involves the cops." Amaka's heart skipped a beat. The voices were unfamiliar, yet there was something about the tone, the way they spoke, that tugged at the edges of her memory. Who were these men? Why did they seem familiar in a way she couldn't quite place? Besides, the second voice continued, "We have leverage. As long as we have her, he'll do exactly what we say." Amaka's mind raced. These men knew her husband well enough to predict his actions. But how? She shifted in her chair, testing the bonds around her wrists. She needed to get out of here, but how? The ropes were tight, cutting into her skin with every movement. "Shut up," a third voice barked, deeper and more menacing. "We'll move her to the next location soon. Keep your eyes open. We can't slip up now." The door creaked open, and a beam of light pierced the darkness of the room. Amaka squinted as two figures entered, their faces obscured by shadows. One of them stepped closer, his face hidden under a hood. "You try anything, and we'll make sure your husband gets pieces of you instead," he growled, his voice icy. Amaka bit back her fear, staring defiantly at the shadowed figures. "He'll find you," she spat, her voice stronger than she felt. "He'll find you, and you'll regret this." The man chuckled, a low, sinister sound that made her blood run cold. "Maybe," he said, leaning in so close she could smell the stench of cigarettes on his breath. "But by then, it might be too late." Amaka's heart pounded in her chest as they backed away, leaving her alone in the dark once more. She had to remain strong, to hold onto the hope that Chijioke would find her. But as the minutes ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that these men were more dangerous than she had initially thought. The familiarity of their voices gnawed at her, an unsettling feeling that she was missing something crucial. Meanwhile, back at Chijioke's home, Chijioke and Ezenwa sat in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. Chijioke's phone sat on the desk, its screen dark and ominous. They were waiting, knowing the kidnappers would call again to arrange the ransom delivery. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. Chijioke sat at his desk, staring at the phone, waiting. His heart pounded with every tick of the clock. Suddenly, the phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Chijioke grabbed it, pressing it to his ear. "Hello?" he said, his voice taut. "You have the money?" The voice on the other end was cold and detached. "I have it," Chijioke replied, keeping his tone steady. "Where do you want it?" "Tomorrow night. Abandoned warehouse off the old Ikoyi road," the kidnapper instructed. "You come alone. No police, no games. If we see anything suspicious, your wife dies." "Understood." Chijioke gritted his teeth. "If you harm her," the kidnapper cut him off. "You're not in a position to make threats. Do as we say and she lives. You try anything, and you'll be picking up pieces of her." Chijioke's grip tightened on the phone. His anger flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I understand. I'll be there." "Good," the kidnapper sneered. "And remember, if we so much as sense the police, it's over for her." The line went dead. Chijioke slowly lowered the phone, his face a mask of fury and fear. Izenwa leaned forward. What did they say? Chijioke took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Tomorrow night, an abandoned warehouse on Ikoyi Road. They want me to come alone. Izenwa nodded, his eyes narrowing. Then we set our man into place. He'll follow and handle them once you have Amaka. Chijioke shook his head, his mind racing. No, it's not enough. Izenwa frowned. What do you mean? We've already arranged everything. The assassin will ensure her safety. That's the problem. Chijioke shot back, his voice rising. I can't just sit back and hope this stranger does his job. This is my wife's life we're talking about. I need to be there. Izenwa's eyes widened slightly. You can't risk going in there. These men are dangerous. If they suspect anything... I know. Chijioke interrupted, his voice hard. But I have to be there. I have to see her with my own eyes. I can't leave her fate in someone else's hands. Izenwa watched him for a moment, then sighed. Very well, but you'll need to follow our plan. The assassin will handle the kidnappers. You go in to make the exchange, but you do not engage. Do you understand? Chijioke nodded, his jaw set. I understand. Izenwa picked up his phone, ready to call the assassin. I'll inform him of the change. He'll adjust his approach accordingly. As Izenwa relayed the plan to the hired gunman, Chijioke felt a surge of determination. He had made many mistakes, had pushed Amaka into this nightmare. Now he had to be the one to pull her out. No matter the risk, he couldn't let her down again. Izenwa hung up, turning back to Chijioke. It's done. He'll be in position, ready to act the moment things go sideways. Chijioke nodded, but his mind was already on tomorrow night. He would walk into that warehouse, money in hand, knowing it could be a trap, knowing that one wrong move could end it all. But he had no choice. Amaka's life was worth any price. Even if it meant walking into hell, he would do it. For her. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please share it with your friends and family. Also leave this video a like. Share in the comments the biggest lessons you've learned from part 1 of this story. And subscribe to the channel so that you'll be the first to watch part 2 when it comes out. Thank you for watching and have a lovely day.